Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, I'm Pavini Moray, and this is Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. And today is a really special episode. I'm facilitating a panel discussion on race and ancestral work. And there are 5 very skillful and soulful ancestral practitioners of varying racial identities here to dig into this dialogue. And my role today is as facilitator. And those folks are going to introduce themselves, but we're just going to start with an opening prayer, which always happens at the beginning of every episode, but you don't usually hear it. And it feels really important today to co-create this prayer with these folks. Well ones and bright ones, beautiful ones and mysterious ones, ancestors of all of those who are gathered here today and all of those who are listening, just wanting to offer such gratitude for the grace of our lives, and for the joy of our breath, and for the gift of your work and your lives. And we're going to do this interview panel today, and really asking that what you want, a world of equity, a world of liberation and healing, comes through you, through us, and out in the context of this discussion. So ancestors, just asking for your blessing, for your guidance, for your wisdom, and for your closeness and your kinship today.
Ulu ushpizin ilain kadishin, ulu imahata ilaata kadishata, exalted mothers, righteous fathers, benevolent ancestors, you who have gone before, you who are such a source of blessing, guidance, connection, and goodness in our lives. Thank you for leaning in to our conversation and connection this day, that it may be for greatest good, for deep transformation, for collective liberation. May the first peoples of the place where we each are, those whose bodies are this land and whose home is where we make our homes, feel our great respect. More than human world, that is the web we weave inside of. It is a gift to be your kin. Thank you.
Egungun, may those who are our blood ancestors and our affinity ancestors, those who would speak through us and for us and move us, please be here with us today. Not just us speaking, but those who are listening. May we also venerate the ancestors of the original inhabitants of the lands that we are all on in this moment. And may we serve as vessels for all truth to be here now, so that we may be elevated and that those that hear us may be elevated. Asheo.
Amen.
Ancestor helping spirits, please guide us and hear these beautiful prayers of all these good people gathered here today. Please help us and guide us and move your wisdom through us as we seek to understand how to talk about and how to find medicine for the cultural trouble of racism and race as we talk about it in the context of our ancestral healing work this day. Please, we ask that you guide us in finding the antidote, the medicine that is needed at this time, so that the ones who are coming, our descendants, don't have to deal with the same old boring problems that we've been dealing with, and they can instead build upon the foundation that we create now. We honor you and we thank you. Please be here and guide us.
So what I'd like to do is to introduce you to these cultural tenders, ancestral healers, beautiful humans, and have them talk a little bit about who they are. And so we'll start with Langston Kahn. Hi, Langston.
Hi, Pavini. I am a shamanic practitioner, and I am Black and queer, and my people come from, on my mother's side, Arkansas. It's hard to trace back beyond that due to slave records, but from genetic testing, I know I have ancestry from Nigeria, from Mali, from Southeastern Bantu peoples, from Benin and Togo, and a few other places as well on that side, like Scotland, due to sort of complicated histories. And on my father's side, my people are primarily German Jewish and Swiss.
Awesome. Welcome, Langston. So nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Taya Shere, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
My great pleasure, Pavini. I'm Taya Shere. My people are of the Jewish diaspora, most recently from the Pale of Settlement, Ukraine, Russia, Poland. I make my home currently on Ohlone land in the Northern California East Bay. I am so deeply delighted to be co-founder and co-tender of the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute, devoted to reclaiming and innovating embodied models of Jewish spiritual leadership in celebration of the goddess. And I am a faculty at Star King School for the Ministry, where I teach organic multi-religious ritual. I also teach online courses in embodied presence, eros, and Jewish ancestral healing, and am so excited to be a part of this conversation and bring my work as a somatic experiencing practitioner and an ancestral lineage healing practitioner to the lens of the conversation. And I'm just deeply excited to create and hear and weave with y'all.
Welcome, Taya. M. Kali Hashiki, could you introduce yourself?
Okay. Hello, I'm M. Kali Hashiki, and I am an erotic healer, helping people to heal their erotic wounds and access their erotic energy for radical transformative fuel. In my personal life, I practice Ifa, which is a West African spiritual tradition that involves ancestor reverence. And oftentimes, as I'm working with clients, it becomes really clear that some ancestral work needs to be done because we're healing not just the wounds, the erotic wounds of this generation, but the erotic wounds of our ancestors. I'm African American. My parents both come from the American South, and I'm first generation Northern born, which has a particular meaning in African American culture. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I know that when you and I spoke last on the podcast, somebody's ancestor came through to say some of the words that came out of my mouth, and I'm open to having that happen again this time. And I'm really excited to meet all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, so much welcome to you and to all of you for gifting your time and your wisdom today. So I thought we'd start with a very simple question of how does race show up in ancestor work? And so whoever wants to start, we'll just popcorn in and out.
I guess I can take part of that question is that I think the funny thing about ancestor work is that it really troubles the idea of race altogether, because race is ultimately a construct. And I think the more you engage with your ancestral lines and in all of their beautiful and intricate specificities, the thinner that concept of race feels. Because just because you had, one ancestor who shared a certain ethnicity in your line does not mean that one ancestor is not having a significant impact on your line necessarily, whereas we like to kind of, use the sort of scientific or very Western sort of government-oriented ideas, like and very racist ideas like blood quanta and stuff like that. When the more you actually get into ancestry itself and really talking to your people and connecting with your different lines, the less that it's easy to make simple racial distinctions, I think. I'll pause there and let someone else speak for a moment. Or I can keep speaking also. Another place that I find that race shows up in ancestor work also is that as we engage with different ancestors, we're tasked with looking at really sometimes complicated histories. Like for me, for example, the reason I mentioned I have some Scottish ancestry on my mother's side. My mother's African American, and the reason that Scottish ancestry is there is because there was an overseer who was Scottish who raped one of my other ancestors, who was enslaved at that time. So, but they're both ultimately my ancestors now. And that doesn't mean that we have to work with all of our ancestors in the same way or accept them. But I think just race can become really troubled and complicated as we begin to move in our ancestral lines. And for me, at least, it's been really helpful as I do that healing work to honor the complexity of my identity and almost has been an antidote to some of the ways that we're asked to sort of compartmentalize parts of our identity or simplify ourselves for others to be able to digest us easier in much of contemporary Western culture.
Cool. Thanks, Langston. Anybody else want to take that on about how you notice race showing up, either in your personal practice with ancestors or in your work with clients?
I can. I actually thought I had unmuted myself when I was talking, and then I realized that no one could hear me. This is Macaulay Hashiki. I think one of the ways that race impacts ancestor work is at least in my experience and with my clients' experience, and I primarily work with queer people of color, is that sometimes we are open and our ancestors are trying to ask us to heal their wounds that they took with them, into the next life or into the next passage. And so as we're trying to heal our wounds and heal their wounds, a lot of their wounds were deeply impacted by racism, or actually, were caused by oppression, racism, marginalization, whatever you want to call it. And so their wounds were created by racism, which then impacts the wounds that we carry from them, in addition to our own wounds that we're trying to heal that are impacted, affected, and often created by the forces of racism. So that when we think about what the particular wounds are, we can't divorce those wounds from the wounding that racism inflicts. And so we have to be mindful of, my ancestors have these particular wounds, and how were they formed in that time, and what of those wounds can be directly or indirectly attributed to the racism that they were forced to live under and with. And I'll stop there.
Well, I'm curious about the ways that you all have found that racism actually impedes ancestral healing work.
For me, how racism impedes or negatively impacts ancestral work really does have to do with this question of what is valued by white supremacy and what is not. And so that means, like, who has access. Those of us who are descendants of colonized folks, people who have been colonized, cultures that have been colonized, how easy is it for us to have access to our own cultural traditions that have been erased or gone deeply underground in order for parts of them to survive? And then how easy does it become for us to then access those? And then also when I just think about, what is valued, what is not valued, there's a lot of interest in white supremacy or white supremacist thought about who someone's ancestors are, but it's very much it's devoid from spirit. It's like, oh, I can trace my ancestors back to the Mayflower, but there's no connection to like the fullness of those ancestors' lives. It's just sort of another way to reinforce hierarchy, as opposed to a way to be open to the lessons that your ancestors have for you, or to be open to having your ancestors, protect and intervene on your behalf. So simplified again, I think the two things are access. Who has easy access to their own cultural traditions? And in what ways has colonization made that difficult? And if for some people not impossible, or the ways that for some people of color, depending on what's trendy in white supremacy, there can be a way in which white folks culturally appropriate a culture and then repackage it and then like resell it to the to the descendants of that culture. I'm thinking a lot about neo-tantra as an example of that in the communities in which I move. And then also this idea of the value of knowing who your ancestors are in white supremacy, but only as a way of reinforcing hierarchy or quote unquote purity or bloodlines, but not really about spirit or the fullness of your ancestors' lives.
I'm curious, and Taya, maybe you could start us off with this one if it speaks to you, because I know in your work you've done some of this, but like, how can ancestral work really help with healing transgenerational trauma, oppression, racism, the kind of the residues that pass through the generations?
This question is such an important one. And I'm feeling into what Fayise spoke about, the creation of whiteness as an identity. And I'm feeling the way that my primary and secondary and tertiary blood lineage ancestors slipped to some degree, or sought to slip to some degree, into that identity of whiteness as a tool for safety and survival once arriving in the United States, and the ways that attempted assimilation cut us off from so much of the deep, rich spiritual tradition in our lineage, and began to erase the deep spiritual heritage. And this connects to the strand also that was spoken into about the distinction between cultural appropriation and cultural exchange. My experience is that engaging ancestral lineage healing work is such an important way to counter cultural appropriation and to reclaim and root in with specificity our unique heritages and birthrights, the stories, practices of our peoples, of their spiritual paths and their relationship with place where they were. I see over and over again with the folks that I have the privilege of sitting with, as they sit with their ancestors, a coming into technicolor, a coming into vibrance and brightness as they begin to connect with bright and well blood lineage ancestors, often quite far back in their lines, that there is beauty and power and spiritual vibrance possible within their own people, within their own tradition, that they don't need to become something else. They don't need to take from someone else. They don't need to borrow something to be whole. That actually the way to be whole is to remember, to root in the gifts of their lines that are deep in their cellular memory, and their ancestral memory, and that is accessible right now. And by cultivating a remembering and an intimacy with ancestors on our lineages, our blood lineages, our family lineages, our spiritual lineages, that we can have a fullness that has in many ways either been stripped from us or was thought to be stripped from us by many different oppressive forces. And so while there are so many different reasons I tend to the work of ancestral lineage healing, a primary one is to open this treasure chest of relationship, of tradition that has often been obscured, and keeps people from knowing the depth of possibility within their own people, but is so available. And so for me, ancestral lineage healing is a deeply counter-oppressive and radical act.
Yeah, thank you, Taya. Anyone else want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll speak to this some. I really appreciate everything you said, Taya. I think just to elaborate a little bit, I think everyone's spoken this a little bit, that part of the reason racism is so insidious is it because it turns people into forces of, assimilation, of erasure and disconnection, whether they're on the giving or receiving end in a sense. It's like whiteness is far less about your skin color and more about ways skin color has been used as an excuse to convince people to sell what makes them unique in exchange for cultural currency and economic and political power in a way that divides them both as a people that could come together and fight those systems of oppression and prevents that from happening, but also divides people up within themselves as they adopt these false divisions. And I think the more that you heal your relationship with your ancestors and begin to learn maybe some languages or their songs or their foods, their clothing, or their way of relating to the sacred, like all those different aspects of your people's unique medicine, the more you begin to really appreciate all the many influences that came to make up who you are in this lifetime. And I think if you're isolated from your people, if there's a lot of pain there, so understandably we don't want to connect because we're afraid of tuning into that pain before it's been sort of reckoned with and healed and processed and metabolized. Unfortunately, we're then much more vulnerable to a lie like racism or any other iteration of the lie of separation, like all the many isms of people being less than other people. I think when you really have taken the time to connect with and know whose shoulders you're standing on, the prices that they paid for you, and when you know that you in your life are the sum total of all their hopes and dreams and aspirations, that you're, literally your ancestors walking, I think then it's almost impossible for people to make you feel less than, because you know who you are, you know what the people that have sacrificed for you, and when someone's mocking you, they're also mocking all of those many people, so you're much less willing to take that kind of bullshit. I think the more that foundation is really strong. So I think the more we heal our ancestral lines, the less we're vulnerable to the lie of racism and the ways that's used to manipulate and disempower people.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you. Really is very striking what you're saying, Langston. So I appreciate that. Yeah, does anyone else want to speak to that?
It's Macaulay Hashiki. I had a godbrother who once we were having a Facebook chat about cultural appropriation or something, and he made a post, and he was speaking. The post was, of course, to people who were never going to read it, but it was something like, "Your ancestors are lonely." And so I really hear what Taya is saying about, when you connect with the fullness of the traditions that your own ancestors had, mostly pre-Christian colonization, then you don't need to appropriate is such polite language. You don't need to steal other people's stuff, because all traditions, all cultures have some sort of particular relationship to the divine, however they define it. And it's always possible to find that in your own lineage. You don't need to go to someone else's lineage. And even if you are, as many of us are in this place and time, a descendant of many lineages, you still don't need to go and take from someone else's lineage in order to be fulfilled spiritually, in order to be fulfilled culturally, in order to feel connection to the land and the people around you. All indigenous cultures before they were colonized had that. And so I think that it is one way to combat cultural appropriation is folks finding out about their own, like really delving deep into their own ancestral traditions.
Thank you. You mentioned, as did Langston, the folks who have multiracial identities, folks who have mixed ancestries. And it's definitely been a theme in the podcast of folks who, can embody both the history of being oppressed as well as the history of being the oppressor in their ancestral lineages. And just curious, I know Langston, this is an identity that you spoke to. Anything that you want to share, other folks want to add about, like, how do you hold that? Like, how do you hold that in your body when both of those things are present?
I think it's a constantly evolving process and question. It's hard to sort of sum up, but I mean, essentially, I think it's changed a lot. When I first started, I think, ironically, the first ancestor who really stepped forward for me was my grandmother, who has Swiss ancestry. And I was doing a ritual at the time, a mediumship ritual with some group I was working with. And she came forward through a medium and just said to me, don't believe everything you've heard about me. I was like, okay. And then, because actually the medium didn't know this, but I had heard a lot of negative stories about her from family members. And so that was one clue that maybe I needed to sort of change some of my perceptions and connect in a different way. And at the time, I was really wanting to know more about my ancestry, but I didn't have any information. Like, my parents didn't have a lot of information. I didn't have access to it. And within a week or two after her sharing that, my parents told me they found a letter that she wrote that said, for Langston, when he writes his book, and it listed out 7 generations of ancestors. So weirdly, the first place that, maybe not so weirdly, but just the first place I started was that line, just because I knew their names. And as I began to connect more, I began to feel a lot of the unwellness of that line. And so that set me back for a little bit. But then so then I kind of flipped over and started really connecting in a big way with both of my mother's lines, who were the different, African-American lineages. And it was really interesting to feel how, as I went into that line, there were a lot of, there were some ancestors who had actively oppressed that line, but were also part of it. And so it was, I don't know, it was interesting to do the work of really witnessing that lineage and moving back past just the more recent people that had actually caused harm, and see the older patterns of wounds that they were playing out within that line. And the more that I was able to do that, to get that sort of longer perspective and find the well ones in those different lines, the less hard it felt to sort of carry those contradictions of oppressor and oppressed. I think there's a lot of ways that all of our lines have that dynamic, especially when you think about all the ways throughout history at different times that men have been really harmful towards women. And we all have men and women in our lines to some extent. So I think we can have personal feelings that are we come by honestly towards ancestors who we know did harm and contributed to cultural troubles in more recent history. But I think if we sort of hold those people as separate and aren't willing to engage in any way with those troubles, we sort of exacerbate the problems that they caused of that, because again, the function of racism and of all of these cultural troubles is separation to some extent. So I think the more connective we can be in our process, that doesn't mean we don't hold these ancestors accountable, but the more we can sort of adopt an attitude of restorative justice or healing justice in our approach and not see any of our ancestors as expendable or disposable, I think the more we can really honor the fullness of ourself and touch into and heal those deep wounds that we carry from those wounds that were visited upon our ancestors.
Not seeing any of our ancestors as expendable or disposable is meets me so well. It's such a brilliant frame, and something I see as so important for so many folks who I sit with, that they've lived a life deeply identified with a particular strand of their blood or family lineage based on who they were raised with or the identity that was most comfortable for them, and that a process of opening to connection with an ancestral line that they have been disidentified with or been afraid of or haven't known much about, that the process of welcoming, or at least initially being curious about that connection and being available for greater intimacy and communication there, like what is possible in initial layers of healing, and in some cases also, as Langston was speaking to, restorative justice, the power is so palpable. I have two strands I want to speak into also to your question, Pavini. The first is I'm hearing really strong the voice of a dear ancestor collaborator of mine, who also is who I first met Makali Ashiki through, beloved Sheikh Ibrahim Baba Farajajeh, feeling a piece that he wrote, "Do My Complexities Frighten You?" He writes, "When I say I am mixed, I mean I am mixed, and I do not want the history, herstory, jerstory of my mixities erased. I do not want to have to hear how complicated my background is, how exotic it is, or how is it possibly credible, because how can you get a mixity with ingredients that you have never imagined being together? I am tired of having the reception of my identities diminished because some people cannot hold more than one thing at a time in their consciousness. I am tired of people thinking that it is okay for them to put me in the box of their choosing because it makes it easier to manage me." I just wanted to speak in those words from Ibrahim Baba here in response also to your question. I have another strand, but I'll hold it for another moment in the conversation.
This is Makali Hashiki. Thank you, Taya, for bringing him here. I think also that we do get to choose. We are not empty vessels for any ancestor to just come through regardless. We get to make a choice. And I think for me, I'm clear that I'm not, Faisal talked about making space somatically for whiteness, or rather not making space somatically for whiteness in one's body, and actually closing down any space there may have been as a form of self-love, self-care, and self-protection. I'm adding some words, and that might not have been your original intention. So I think for me, I'm really clear that when I say I'm not holding space for white healing, that also includes my own ancestors. My mother's name is, like, we've been able to actually figure out which slave owner that name came from, and it would be unwise to assume that there was not necessarily any rape happening on that plantation. So while I don't have names of white ancestors, knowing that I come from enslaved African Americans means to me that there's more than likely I have white ancestors, and not that far back, because my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a sharecropper, and his father, so my great-grandfather, was born in slavery. And so I get to choose whose healing I am allowing in my life. And just in the same way that I devote my life for the living, and I focus on the healing of queer and trans people of color, although white folks who are down are also welcome. In my ancestral work, I'm pretty much only holding space for my African American and any indigenous folks of the Americas that are in my ancestral line. And that's a choice that everyone gets to make. I don't necessarily see it as saying that my ancestors are disposable, my white ancestors are disposable, but I'm not making space for them in my ancestral work.
Thanks. I'm Kali Hashiki. I so appreciate this piece that you bring around consent, right, and choice. And it's a conversation that you and I have had in the past. Mm-hmm. And just really grateful for your continued ferocity about it, actually. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
There's a meme that's has been on Twitter and Facebook recently, and I'm just going to read it. It's the person's name on Twitter is Yoli Writer, and her name is Yolanda. And the meme is, "White people, no one is asking you to apologize for your ancestors. We are asking you to dismantle the systems they built and you maintain." And I just wondered if anyone wants to comment on that, because it seems particularly resonant to this point in the conversation that we're having around who do we relate with.
A strand that I would love to speak into here is the tension that I experience in my Jewish communities, the conversations that I'm in with folks in my community around how we can simultaneously work to dismantle white supremacy and also work to dismantle whiteness as centralized in Jewish identity, and kind of what that means for many white passing Jews who don't identify as white and don't identify as people of color, and understand that a way to show up as allies for racial justice means getting really well rooted with our own people and doing the work that is needed to counter oppression, and kind of while walking the dance of folks who are white passing but not white identified.
Yeah, it's actually something that I wanted to turn towards today, is how does getting right with our ancestors, no matter what our racial backgrounds and racial identity is, how does that not become a form of bypassing, right? And Langston, you brought this question of the risk of doing this work with ancestors, with ancestral reverence, and transforming allowing healing to happen in our bloodlines. Is there a risk that then that doesn't get translated into our activism, our oh cool, I'm all good with my people, how do we still maintain that there are actual systems of oppression in effect, that there's laws, that there's structures, the prison industrial complex, all of those things, the institutionalized racism, right, that's still existing. How do we, what's the balance there with that, with doing the work and not forgetting the other piece of the work, which Faisal named, yeah?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I guess I would say that I think, as I'll speak for myself, as a contemporary Western person myself, it's easy to get confused around ideas like either doing activist work or doing inner work, because we don't have a framework necessarily of complementary dualism. We get caught in these frameworks of light versus dark, or inner work versus outer work, instead of seeing these two things inform and interweave with each other and are actually completely dependent on each other to create effective change in the world. And so in my experience, there's almost no true transformation of systems without transformations of the individual, and vice versa. An individual can't actually transform if they're not actively working to create a system, a community, a structure that supports them in being the new person they're becoming, because otherwise they'll just get subsumed into the old system. It's really, you can't be that rugged individual creating the changes completely alone. I think that's a myth. And so I think the danger of bypass arises when we only focus on our own small individual spiritual journey and aren't addressing it anywhere, kind of keeping our head in the sand around that larger systemic and cultural work. But partly because it's very hard to really experience the fullness of who we are, our soul, our purpose, our people, if we're not serving a bigger vision than ourselves in community. And so I think, just part of it is just committing, just making the internal commitment to both parts of the process, the work of seeing what's happening in your local community and working to take concrete actions that reflect the inner work that you're doing. And if you're just doing outer work and community, actually taking the time to tune in with yourself and your inner life and your people, and allowing that to also inform the work that you're doing. But I think that's, for me, just to go back a little bit, when I said, I don't think our ancestors are disposable or expendable. Yeah, I didn't mean that in any way with any judgment for people who choose consciously not to engage with certain ancestor line for any reason. And for me, I feel the work that I'm personally called to do has a lot to do with, just because of who I am, with sort of bridging certain gaps and going to those places of friction culturally, where there are people with a lot of different perspectives. And for me personally, in my process, I find that if I'm not actively working towards the goal of the healing of all of my people, which, is in some ways a lifelong process, because we're continuing to tend not just the people that are already dead, but also our living family members when they pass, and our communities. I think that for me, I feel I start to perpetuate, or I've noticed times in my life when I've started to perpetuate problems that I'm working to change, when I still carry that unwellness that I'm working to combat within myself. And sometimes that's not to say that we have to be perfect before we do anything, but I think we need to hold the perspective of allowing our outer work to show us the places where we need to transform to really become the person who can truly bring to completion that outer work, or do it in a good way, and also allow that inner work to show us when we've reached a place where to actually move into the next level of transformation within ourselves, we need to move that medicine we've rescued into actual action, so it becomes a tangible, concrete blessing in our lives and in the world, and not just something in our inner space.
So we started with prayer and an invitation to our ancestors to let the healing and the right words and the right medicine move through us. And what I'd like to invite us all into now is a more ritual moment of dropping in and connecting with them, and just seeing what else do they really want to come through this platform and to ripple out into the world. So let's just take some breaths with that, and when you feel called to speak, and we'll just we'll let it go for a few minutes. Yeah. So while these folks are dropping in and connecting with their ancestors, it's going to take a minute. I'm just going to invite you all who are listening to do the same thing. What's it like to sit quietly and just invite in the wisdom of your bright ones for the next few minutes? And then we'll come back together and hear what everyone's ancestors had to say.
What I hear from my people is a deep reminder of the power of rooting in positive resource, of rooting in positive resource in our lineages, of rooting in positive resource in what is well and vibrant and whole in our bodies and our embodied experience and our connection with the land. What is most well in our communities, just remembering that the way trauma heals in the body, in the ancestral system, is by beginning in the place of greatest resource, attending to the places of trouble and fragment, but not vortexing there, not only being guided by that, and being in a dance that allows the deep struggle and the deep ease to be one that is a continued conversation. And so what I hear from my people who are not at such ease with this conversation, I love interviews, and have been watching myself throughout our conversation in much less embodied ease than is familiar for me, and curious about that and understanding that as connected to my ancestral systems of a sense of Jewish belonging, and where do we belong in conversations of race and identity and ethnicity? Where do we place ourselves? And the reminder that I'm receiving, that I'm sharing, is again anew to root in a sense of deep belonging and curiosity. Thank you.
We really are our ancestors' wildest dreams. That we can be here existing on this planet in this time, that we can have this conversation, that we can be living our lives as fully as we are capable of, is something that our ancestors have dreamed and dreamt for us and have made possible for us. And what I often hear from my ancestors, that I'm hearing really strongly in this moment, is not to forget that they have been there for you, they are there for you. And sometimes you just hear their whispers on the wind, but they were always open to a fuller, deeper connection with you. All you have to do is ask.
Thank you for everyone's beautiful words. As I tune into my people, what they're speaking a lot about is just, again, we've all talked about in different ways, how the function of racism, and really any ism, is separation in part, among many other complex, insidious functions. But they wanted to focus on that sense of separation and have us to notice when we are in a moment where someone is trying to separate us from our people, to separate us from the earth, instead of lashing out in a way that dehumanizes or tries to separate them as well, taking a moment before we respond to really allow ourselves to drop back into that connection with our people and with the earth. And from that place of connection, to then allow the larger voice of our people and of the earth to move through us in response. Enough so that anger is an appropriate response to that kind of language. It absolutely is. But to allow that larger anger at that function of separation to pull that other person, or make an effort to pull that other person back into connection, rather than to further that separation that that person is an instrument of, feels important to speak to my people at this time, to just this sense of noticing when we're being cut off from something, and what we need to do to take care of ourselves, to reconnect before we do anything else.
So I'd like to end like we started, with co-creative prayer. Small ones and bright ones, you fill us with your good words and your good sense of the way things actually and truly are when we get below the surface of our separation and into the levels of our grief and our love and our resource and our humanity. And you remind us to come back to those things again and again. I want to say thank you for all of the beautiful ways that you showed up and supported this conversation, and have supported us in knowing what to say for impact and for healing and for liberation for all beings.
Thank you, Agun, for your attention, for your time, for your presence, for the ways in which you not only shape our words and shape our truth and shape our bodies, but the ways in which you help us connect deeper with ourselves and with each other. Thank you for bringing this particular group of divine, wise beings together at this time so that we may grow and learn and share. And thank you for all of those who are listening and who are able to discern whatever kind of healing words that make a difference in their own transformation and in their own connection with their ancestors. Ashe.
I want to honor all the many people that have gathered here. We thank you, Ancestor Helping Spirits, for helping us to have this rich dialogue together. And I ask that you continue to bless us with your presence and your guidance. We ask that all that is good come to us so we are supported in our own goodness. We ask that all that is true come to us so we know our truth and have the courage to live it. We ask that all that is beautiful come to us so we have the power to create beauty in the world. And we ask that all that is wise come to us so we continue to gain from the wisdom of those who have come before, so we can be good ancestors to those who are coming. Thank you.
Osa shalom b'mrameha hi ta'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol yoshvei tevel. May the radiant presence and presences, the ones who bring deepest blessing, infuse all of the reverberations of this conversation, we who are in connection, all who are listening, with the answering of our deepest prayers.
Blessed be. You've been listening to this special episode of Bespoken Bones with me, Pavini Moray, and Mkali Hashiki, and Langston Kahn, and Taya Shere, and Tensi, and just wanting to thank you for listening. And if you feel engaged by what you heard, would like to encourage you to reach out and drop me a line, reach out to any of these fine ancestral practitioners if you want support with your own connections and healing with your ancestors. Just so grateful for the goodness and love that has been moving through these ones. This is Bespoken Bones, and we'll be back every new and full moon with more embodied wisdom and ancestral goodness.